read the bottom part first, because those are the take-home messages, and if you fall asleep partway through the talk, you've got the important things anyway. No, whoops, it's this little red button. This will be a theme that I probably won't make as clear slide by slide as I should, notwithstanding the fact that the ecosystem approach makes us all think about the natural environment. After 27 years in our ministry and a lot of international settings, my conclusion is most of our major failings when we've had fisheries management failures, and I've known a few personally, have not come because we've been dramatically wrong in either how the ecosystem works or the biology of the species we're exploiting and managing. We're just really lousy at human ecology. And that, I hope, will come out of a number of points that I make through the talk. With regard to how I ended up in the title, in a way, this is a good model for how we should think about exactly where we are in ecosystem approach to management of fisheries. We have the power now. We've won the revolution. And we have a lot of support because we promised everybody, well, if you take an ecosystem approach, everything will be better. Now we have to show them that really will be better. We've got to deliver on some of these promises that people believe we've made about the improvements that are going to come from taking an ecosystem approach to management. And a lot of my talk will not be on the abstract concepts we're dealing with, but some short-term things that need to get done to deliver some of the expectations. This is just a very incomplete list of all the different policy innovations at national and international levels, which have ecosystem approach, ecosystem-based management, or some similar language in it. This is now the foundation of fisheries management policy just about everywhere you go. Even some of the terms are in the Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization. Now, this puts us in a really awkward situation. If we go back to, say the 1970s, we had an analytical framework given to us by Beverton and Hull, Bill Ricker on this coast, which enabled us to do some basic fish population dynamics. We didn't have a lot of data streams, but by maybe the mid-1980s, we actually had the data streams in place as well. And we had a fisheries policy framework, single species management, and the science tools that were pretty much in harmony. But science, it's not a linear increase, but we increase our knowledge and understanding incrementally and gradually. Policy doesn't change incrementally and gradually. Policy changes in big steps. So even by the time that the fish stocks agreement in '95 became the new pillar for fisheries management, the science community was already saying, oh, this single species concept is way too simple. You're missing the boat. You guys are living in the dark ages in policy. And we started selling the ecosystem approach by the 1990s. You can find lots of illustrations of that. And just about the beginning of this decade, policy said, okay, you've convinced us. And we made that big step, so now the ecosystem approach is in all the policy documents we look at. And policy is turning to science and saying, okay, now here's the advice we need. And science is saying, oh, God, no, we don't know any of that. Give us 20 years and a whole lot of research money. Come back and we might have some answers for you. That's not good enough. What can we do about it? We may need some help. We have to adjust the activities we do as scientists, managers, and policymakers, and some of the attitudes we have. About 4 days ago when I was asked, maybe can you cut your talk from 60 minutes to 45? All the stuff on attitude change is gone. It had some of the cutest slides. But we can't ask policy to go back. There are people who would like that to happen, but none of us think that's the right change. So instead, science actually has to do some work and solve some management problems, and solve them soon, not decades from now. Now, I'm working with the FAO list of what's in the ecosystem approach. It's pretty high level, and I think it covers the key things. It's got the external forces and the dynamics of the parts of the ecosystem you're exploiting. It's got the accountability for the full footprint of the activity of fishing, not just the impact of fishing on the target species. It's got the changes in governance to be inclusive and participatory that begin to deal with the human ecology sector of it. And it's got the integration, and I should have had adaptation. Every time I hear Andre talk, I want to redo my PowerPoint before I get up. Across the different human activities in the sea. That's what the ecosystem approach that I'll be talking about addresses. Now, I'm going to take those 4 pillars individually. In classic Beverton and Holt Ricker fish stock dynamics, a lot of different equations, but they basically said stock next year is this year's stock increased by whatever the recruits coming in are and how much the fish that are there grow, decreased by the number that die for some reason other than fishing, and the number that are fishing. Conceptually, a pretty simple single species model, made even simpler because it was assumed growth rate, natural mortality can be treated as a constant over time, more or less. Recruitment's a function of spawning biomass. That is the size of the stock a few years ago, where a few depends on the age composition of the population. And all we really need to do analytically is model the interactions among fishing mortality, spawning biomass, and recruitment. And we've got ourselves an analytical framework on which to base management decision making. At no time in my long years dealing with fisheries did anyone really believe that any of those terms were constant, nor did they believe that recruitment was simply a function of spawning biomass in some simple way. It was known that they're all affected by the biotic conditions, and this has made food web people really happy for decades because they've had a reason to exist. And there's all kinds of indirect effects and interactions. And fishing interacts with all those direct and indirect effects and interactions. This is a glorious situation for scientists to work in. And we could get caught here forever dealing with this dynamic problem. We could get caught because most of us have backgrounds in biology. This is what we were trained to do. The problems are really interesting. And one of the risks we face is that there's a tendency, just because everything interacts with everything else, you take any problem you want to work and define it just to the point so that it's so complex you can't answer it. And then you've got yourself a research problem. And we've had a long history of doing that. And the reason that's particularly dangerous is just about the time you've made the problem or the model so complex that you can't quite understand it, you've also made it just about complex enough that you can't prove your answer is wrong with any of the data streams you've got. So you've got this real validation risk in just about any of the science we do. So what I sat back and did in preparing this talk was think, when do each of the terms back in this equation actually really matter? Recruitment. Now, in a well-managed fishery, how much should variation in recruitment affect short-term yield? Rule of thumb, whatever sustainable F is for a particular population, it's real unlikely that it's much more than twice the natural mortality rate. Not guaranteed that it is, but as a rule of thumb, that's keeping f equals m is not a bad idea. Once f gets twice m, maybe you ought to be a little bit concerned. And m, this is one of the points, if you read the bottom of the slide when I told you to. This is a classroom. You pretend you're students. You're supposed to do what the professor says. One of the things we need to do more of is apply basic life history theory, which didn't have a role in Ricker and Beverton and Holt when they were building the first analytical framework, to what we're doing in managing and analyzing population dynamics, managing populations. 2 weeks ago, at the Working Group on Ecosystem Effects of Fishing at ICES, 3 or 4 different research teams working separately pooled incomplete results and put together some nice little studies. You can estimate a sustainable total mortality rate, Z for total mortality, with a pretty simple equation. It's a coarse estimate, but we're talking about all the things in the system for which you can't do a massive age-structured, ultra-Bayesian super analysis. And you can get T, the maximum time that a population may live, from direct aging if you've got hard parts, or from just K and L infinity if you've got some life history theory to work with, if you can estimate those from fitting growth models. You can get what is the maximum age that that individuals in this population should reach when they get as old and gray as I am. And from that, you can get an estimate of about what a sustainable exploitation rate in the long term should be. It'll put you in the neighborhood of 20% of the spawning biomass if you've got a gadoid type lifestyle. By the time you're down to rockfish, if you're taking more than about 3% of the biomass, you're probably pushing that population pretty hard. These are very coarse analyses, but you get some interesting things out of it. We took a bunch of survey data for the North Sea, and this is basically all the species that are taken in the North Sea trawl survey. And from basic life history theory, developed estimates of what we thought the sustainable exploitation rate as a percent of standing stock should be. And then from surveys themselves, estimated what the actual exploitation on those species is in the real world. Fitter and could develop a boundary between what's sustainable and what isn't sustainable. Fit a smoother through it because that's one of the things you do to data these days. What's this information tell us? Well, if you look at this index of overexploitation, which is only a couple weeks old, relative to the trends in the populations based on estimating population trends from surveys, you've got a pretty good fit to the populations that are being overexploited, the ones up in this area, and the trend in the population over the last 20 years. These are some pretty simple things you can do in what we used to call, oh, these are the data poor situations where there's not much. We can come up with exploitation indices. We can come up with what portion of the population needs to be exploited without getting into all the complexities of modeling and understanding recruitment dynamics. This gives us some useful things to take directly into management out of data we've all got lying around right now. So when does recruitment matter in that equation? If you've got populations with a life history much longer than a herring, it probably shouldn't matter very much. You should be exploiting that population in a way that the recruitment variation is a small part of the yield. What matters is if productivity changes. And we'll pick that up when we look at some of the other terms. growth. There's a lot of research on environmental influences on growth rate. It's a great thing to give people to do master's degrees and stuff with. What matters in terms of management is that if you've got a cohort that happens to be growing faster than the average for that population, it's going to show up in your assessment as an unexpected little drop in F. And reviewing about 80 fish stock assessments done by ICES, NIMS, and Canada, the drop is very unlikely to be much more than about 10% in the short term. And the consequence is going to be, oh, we've got a bunch of extra yield to take in the future years. It's not a bad outcome. If you've got a cohort growing slower than usual, you can get a big, very short-term spike in F. It's not uncommon for it to be a greater than 25% increase in fishing mortality in the short term, combined with the fact that if it's growing slower than usual, if you have fisheries with a potential for bycatch and discarding, you get even more catch of these small fish. And you can get a depletion of biomass in the short term that has very long and persistent consequences for several years afterwards. So you know that one of the things you should look for are signals that you've got a cohort coming in, or you've got environmental conditions that are going to make growth slower than the recent average. One of the obvious conditions where that is often observed is classroom, recruitment of a particularly strong year class. There's a lot of mechanisms that can lead to a reduction in growth rate of a very strong cohort. Carrying capacity issues, size-dependent mortality issues, and that's a particularly insidious problem because the yield you're going to estimate from a really strong recruiting cohort is a big yield. And if you've overestimated its growth rate, you're going to put all that yield into the older, bigger individuals in the population, leads to a bunch of undesirable consequences. If you've got size-selective genetic consequences of fishing, they skyrocket under those conditions. You've got a whole lot of difficult things. So one of the issues to deal with in this environmental forcing, watch growth rates of strong year classes and don't get them wrong because there's a big cost to overestimating their growth. Natural mortality may be one of the least well-studied and most important parts of how the environment affects stock dynamics. If you've got a carrying capacity effect, all the biotic drivers in the system come into play in natural mortality. If you've got top-down control,